The House Study Committee on Annexation, De-Annexation, and Incorporation, House Resolution 743, is now called to order. I'm Chairman Jan Tankersley from House District 160. I'm chair of the Intergovernmental Coordination Committee and chair of the Study Committee. I'd like to welcome all of you and just let you know that I appreciate the time that you've taken out of your busy schedules to be here today. My committee members are Chairman Ed Reinders to my left, Chairman Tom Taylor, Representative Beth Beskins, and Representative Mary Margaret Oliver. Everyone's here today. Today, for this particular committee meeting, we're going to focus strictly on incorporation of municipalities. The final meeting for us will be Tuesday, October the 6th, and that's going to be an opportunity for additional information from previous speakers or for other comments or questions from the committee. We have reserved the last 20 minutes of this meeting today for public comments for each speaker who signs up, and the sign-up sheet is available here at the podium, and you will be allowed 2 minutes each. That's 2. I know that's a short period of time, but you certainly have the option to submit detailed comments by way of email to the committee, to all the committee members for consideration. And just as a friendly reminder again, this committee will not tolerate personal attacks, threats, or other disruptive behavior during the public comment portion of the meeting. And if you do exhibit that sort of behavior, you'll be asked to please leave our meeting. I would at this time ask you to silence your electronic devices. If you are here with a group when we reach the public comment portion of this meeting, you may think about having one spokesperson so that we can avoid repetition of your message. And if you didn't sign up for any reason prior to the meeting, please take a few minutes now to sign in if you'd like to speak. Just wanted to stress that. I do think it's important to remember that this study committee's overall mission is to review the conditions, needs, issues, and problems relevant to annexation, de-annexation, and incorporation, and if necessary, and I don't know that it will be, but if it is necessary, this committee may have recommendations for legislation, or we may not. We'll see what our findings are before we abolish this committee in December. Please keep in mind that this is not a town hall meeting, and it's not a hearing. It's just an opportunity for these appointed study committee members to closely examine our current process and look at this process that legislators follow and how this process impacts the citizens that we serve all over our great state. The agenda today includes Jeff Lanier from Legislative Council. We have someone here representing the Georgia Municipal Association. I believe it's Tom Gell and Susan Moore. We have ACCG, the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia, as well. And we have Ted Baggett from the Carl Vinson Institute of Government to speak to us. I would like to let you know that typically cityhood bills or incorporations are assigned to governmental affairs, which is chaired by Chairman Ed Reinders. But the Speaker does have the authority to assign them wherever he chooses. And last year, or maybe it was the year before, during that session, a city creation was assigned to my committee. So I did adopt a rule that would require the 2-year layover in the fiscal study, just to be on the safe side. But hopefully most of those will go to governmental affairs. Since 2005, we do seem to see a definite increase of new municipalities. Some of them that come to mind would be Sandy Springs, Dunwoody, Johns Creek, Milton, and on the south side of town, the Chattahoochee Hills city. This trend although it does appear to be primarily in the metro area, we do have city creations going on in other parts of the state. So I would like for us to keep in mind as we listen to our presenters today, it's my hope that we just come away with a better understanding of the issues that impact the entire state of Georgia, not just here in the metro area, And we just want to look at any issues that seem to surface during the incorporation process. At this time, I would like to call on Jeff Lanier from Legislative Counsel to talk to us a little bit about, I asked him to speak about the state code section, primarily 36-30-7-1, and it's titled Inactive Municipalities. And I wanted Jeff to tell us what does this code section specifically address. Is it to establish municipalities, or is this code section addressed just to already established municipalities, or does it deal with creating new municipalities? So I'm going to turn it over to him, and he may feel free to discuss to talk about other code sections that are relevant to incorporations. So Jeff, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. And last time we were here, of course, we were focused just on annexation and de-annexation. Incorporation is a kind of a totally different animal, but still it's a creature of the General Assembly. I think the last time I was before you, I made mention of the fact that all municipalities are in essence creatures of the General Assembly. You're free to set them up, dissolve them, add to them, detract from them, whatever you want to do in creation or change or elimination of a municipality. So incorporation is no different. Our law does have certain standards that must be met by someone who is seeking to incorporate a city. For instance, and most of these are contained, by the way, in Chapter 31 of Title 36 of our code. One basic standard is you've got to have at least 200 people in the city. Have to have a density within that same area, though, of 200 people per square mile. 60% of the lots and tracts have to be set aside for residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, recreation, or government use, and at least 60% of the total acreage is divided into tracts of 5 acres or less. In other words, it needs to look like a city, and it needs to have a sufficient density of population that city services would be required there and would be feasible to provide. But those are just basic minimum standards that we have for the creation of a city. And beyond that, it's kind of the game's wide open. Most of the cities we've been creating would have met these standards without any problem whatsoever. Most of the cities that we've created have been fairly huge in the last several years as far as population goes, as far as density goes, as far as land use goes. Those things get there. It's interesting, most issues that I have run into with incorporation in the last several years are not really questions of law. They're more questions of how the General Assembly deals with a bill proposing to incorporate the city. The Governmental Affairs Committee of the House, much like, Madam Chair, you were talking about your committee, have adopted rules that deal with creation of cities and have set in some standards. And let me back up one second, though. The bill creating a city is a local bill. No matter what you do with it, it is a local bill. It only affects a minute area of Georgia, and it does not affect the rest of the state. So by definition, it is a local bill. The General Assembly has chosen, at least in the House, to treat bills incorporating cities as general bills. That doesn't change the fact that it's a local bill. You're just treating it for purposes of the legislative process as a general bill. In other words, it will go through the committee processes rather than just being a consent situation like most local legislation is. But it's like I'm fond of saying, you can treat a cat like a dog, but it doesn't change, it's still a cat. You know, you can do anything, you can treat something however you want to, but it doesn't change its essential character of being whatever it was. So what we have run into is, in the past several years, both your committee and Representative Rinder's committee have adopted rules that, and before that, Governmental Affairs, I guess for about the last 4 years, has had rules in place that require a process very similar to that of retirement legislation in the General Assembly, although that is set forth by statute how we handle retirement bills. But basically it involves introducing the bill in the first year of the biennium, studying it over the interim, Usually that's being studied by either the Carl Vinson Institute of Government or the Andrew Young School here at Georgia State, and determining the financial and other feasibility of whether or not such city is viable for the purposes of creating it, whether it's destined to failure or it has a chance to go. And then in the second year, the bill is up for consideration as to whether or not you choose to incorporate it. Having said that, we have tended to make exceptions fairly commonly to those rules, which has caused a good bit of confusion in the process. And somebody says that I'm not being treated the way that other people are. Other issues have dealt mainly with the political aspect, which I'm not really an expert on. I'm proud to say I don't do policy. I draft your legislation, and you do policy, not me. Makes my job a whole lot easier. But most of the political issues deal with who's out and who's in with a particular municipality. And that's where the war is. Some people don't want to be in. Some people desperately want to be in. And where you draw the lines is always a matter of grave concern to those people. And speaking of line drawing, at some point in time, you may want to ask the Reapportionment Office, Gina Wright and Brian Knight, for their thoughts on the line drawing process, because these things will come into play later on when it comes time to redistrict. And there are limitations on what their systems can do now, because they're operating off census block data. And a lot of times when you're setting up a municipality, block data doesn't go into, shall we say, a fine enough point in order to get in the neighborhoods you want and exclude the neighborhoods you don't want in creating the city. So, but they have some concerns in that regard, and they're valid and need to be taken into consideration in the process. And then, of course, we had the situation we had come up last year, where we have cities that overlap. Everybody's claiming the same piece of territory, which is a train wreck waiting to happen if you can't find ways to resolve that, because you can't create cities that have claim to the same territory, and the studies on which the viability of the city is based, if you remove territory, immediately cast into question the viability of the study, not just the viability of the city, but whether the study is valid anymore. So those things have to be taken into account. Then we have the concept that's come up, and this one is legally based. People have been seeking what is something we've kind of gotten to a general nomenclature of these days, called city light. And for purposes of a definition, that is a city that provides less than the full panoply of services that are normally associated with a city. Let me start out by saying, in Georgia, in my legal opinion, you cannot create a city which has less than all of the powers provided by law for any city in the state. You cannot create one that does not have all those powers. I think as soon as you create a city, whether it's spoken or not, they have all the powers of a municipality, both stated and unstated, in their charter. It's just there. We have tried, however, to address the concerns where people did not want their city to go out and be a full-fledged, full-blown operating municipality that covers everything on the waterfront. And we've tried to do that in, I think, Peachtree Corners in Gwinnett County is probably the first example where we've tried to do this. And to restrict the use of those powers down. What Peachtree Corners has is they are given the full list of powers that any city in Georgia can have. They have all the powers. But there's a provision in the charter that says you cannot operate under those other than certain enumerated powers to provide services unless the city, you go to a referendum and have the city vote on authorizing you to proceed forward. There's a lot of legal debate back and forth. I think in your folders you have letters from two prominent attorneys who take the position that you can't do that. We in our office, we have kicked it around. I'm not real certain how the courts would handle that. The letters that you have characterized that particular issue as a restriction on the powers. And under the Constitution, you cannot take away powers by local law. It could only be done by general law, and then you can't take them away totally. You can only restrict them by general law. However, the opposite analysis, which is not mentioned in those letters, which does come out, is this is not a substantive thing. In other words, the powers have not been removed from the city. In fact, it's specifically in their charter given to them. So they have the full set of powers. But there's a procedural mechanism that's been put in place that says you can't operate under this power to provide these services unless you do X, Y, and Z. If we could, let's kind of analogize that for the purposes of clarity to a situation where you say, okay, I want to give you the power to raise ad valorem taxes in the city, but you must have a supermajority of the council in order to enact it. Do you have the power to raise taxes? Yes, you do. But it's conditioned upon a supermajority doing it, which is procedural. In this particular case, with Peachtree Corners, you have the power to provide all these services that are possible under your powers, but it's conditioned upon a procedural vote of the people to go into certain areas. What the courts would do with this when that comes up, should it ever become before the courts, I can't tell you. It's really questionable. I could argue it both ways. But suffice it to say, the city-like concept has some controversy to it. And this is our best attempt to try to meet the desires of the people who want that legislation to do it. And Madam Chair, you mentioned Code Section 36-30-7.1, which I also believe is in your folders if you're interested in looking at it. That piece of legislation was enacted quite a few years ago. In fact, I think Representative Larry Walker may have been the main proponent of that. And if you notice, well, maybe you don't have that in front of you, but its placement in the law, if you notice, it's 36-30-7.1. 36-30-7 is the surrender of your charter provisions of law. And this is 7.1 to follow that with an additional thought, if you would, in putting together. It was designed to try to cull out in Georgia those municipalities which were basically existing in name only. It applies only to a municipality that is extant, not one that's being created. It is one that is actually in existence in Georgia. And in summary, what it says is that in order to be an active municipality in Georgia and remain an active municipality in Georgia, you have to provide 3 services, you have to have elections, and you have to have at least 6 meetings a year, is the way it was set up. You got to understand, in Georgia, previously, we had even more cities than we have now. I mean, we are right now laboring under the distinction of having the most counties, I think, of any state other than perhaps Texas, and I think Texas has, but by land area, much further. And we have a ton of cities. If you look at the way many states do it, they certainly, if the county gets very small, they only have maybe one city in the county, and it's maybe coterminous with the county, and they've merged the government. In Georgia, we have counties, my county of Gwinnett, where I live, I think we have 16, Dan, what's the number? 16 municipalities in Gwinnett County alone. And Gwinnett County is not the biggest county in the state of Georgia. It's rather large, but it's not the biggest county in Georgia. So you have a ton of this. If you look at the census data, which is always amazing to me, as of the 2010 census, in Georgia, we have 234 cities with less than 1,000 people in them. That's a little bit amazing, but 47 of them have less than 200 people in them. And amazingly, more than that, 8 of them have less than 100 people in them. How you operate a city with that, I don't know. I know in the previous hearings before the Governmental Affairs Committee last year, we were looking at a matter dealing with the Ethics Commission, and there was testimony concerning how the difficulty of small jurisdictions and their, don't take this in the negative, but the lack of sophistication in dealing with computer systems and all those things, how it affected them in their ability to comply with provisions of the Ethics in Government Act. And one of the things was they were pointing out that, you know, sometimes the mayor is also the head. He actually operates the waterworks. I mean, literally operates the waterworks. And one of the councilmen literally, you know, takes care of sanitation, picks up the trash and handles it. You know, you're getting down to the basic levels there, and they meet the minimum services, but only by a little bit. You know, and it reminds me, when you look at these things, this 36-30-7.1 is not meant to be the goal that you're shooting for a city. When I was in law school, I was taking civil procedure my first year in law school, and I had a professor. I wish I had him my third year when I understood more about the law. I think I could have been much better about it. But he was talking about drafting your complaints and drafting your motions and whatnot in litigation. And he was pointing out, he said, you know, everybody's going to have books of what they call litigated forms in their offices. There's forms that have been the subject of lawsuits, and the courts have approved them. He said, don't use them. The courts have approved them, but why do you think they were in litigation to start with? They're C-level forms. You know, 36-30-7.1 addresses what is a C-level municipality, one that is just barely functioning. And it should not be the goal, and it shouldn't be the standard by which we create cities. We've also had discussions in the past, and I'll wrap up here. We have had proposals both by Senator David Edelman when he was in the Senate here and Representative Mike Jacobs when he was in the House, dealing with the concept of townships. And that was a desire by on both of those members' parts, as I understand it from their public statements, that they wanted to address the concerns that people have that lead to people wanting to create cities. And most of the time, well, let me say, I can't say most of the time, but a good bit of the time, the reason people want to create cities is not because they want a city. Now, sometimes it's a defensive reaction to being annexed into a city that you don't want to be in. But most of the time, it's a result that they want to feel closer to government. They feel that the county government is unresponsive to their wants or needs, or that their tax money doesn't seem like it's coming back to them as they want it, or they have land use issues, or they have code enforcement issues. And the township thing was desired to create a government that's not a city, but that could address some of those basic issues. The bills have gone nowhere, but as you see with the cities continuing to come before the General Assembly, and those desires keep being expressed more and more, that is another area the committee might want to look at. Is there some sub-level of government that's not a city that could be created that would address the basic concerns these people have for their area? Those would be my comments today, Madam Chair. I'd be willing to, if the committee has questions on this area, I'd be glad to respond.
I think we'll have some questions, but thank you for clarifying that on that particular code section. I actually have one of those small little towns in my district, has less than 200 people now, and they can barely provide 3 services, but that keeps them as an active municipality, because it's not to say that they're empowered to do them all, as you said, but they actually do 3. And they've recently had some financial difficulties, and I don't know where it's going to go, but you made a great point. Also, while I have you, and I have the mic, I did want to ask, does Georgia Code, current Georgia Code, provide a list of services that are required to create a new municipality? Because folks seem to be using the section you just discussed for us. Do we have an existing code with a list of services, or any portions of code that you would like to say do apply? I think you did briefly touch on the number of meetings and being certified by DCA.
There's no particular code section that is of the nature you're describing. I mean, there is a constitutional provisions that provides the sweeping powers we give under home rule to cities and counties. But as far as saying you must, and when you create a city it does this, this, and this, there's no code section that does that, which I think further underscores my point that when you create a city, it's a city. There's no limited powers you can give it. So as a result, there's no need to enumerate that you've got to have this, this, and this, because it's going to have all of them. So, no, ma'am, there's not.
Because the charter is considered a local law, and general law is something that would be applicable to the entire state,
yes,
not just one particularly newly created city.
Yes, ma'am.
Number 24, let's see. Is that you? Representative Mayor Margaret Oliver.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to address 2 things, if I may. This issue of the computer technology of the reapportionment office is something that Gina and I have talked about extensively. And in that, the Voting Rights Act applicability has changed dramatically, and in that we have intensive growth, and in that we're having a lot of city annexation issues, it's very clear to me that this existing program is just simply not usable in most of the issues that we're dealing with here. Has anybody begun the study of what it's going to cost or to develop software that is more user-friendly at this time? Do you know?
To my knowledge, I am unaware of any. We've had that discussion off and on, and Brian may be a better person to answer the question from his office's perspective. I think a lot of it's going to be driven by the fact that the Census Bureau dictates a lot of the data and its format and so forth, and I don't know how willing they are to devolve down to lesser levels. And therefore, I'm not sure if there's any impetus to design a program that would fit just Georgia's needs.
I'm suggesting an impetus here because
I see the impetus now.
my constituents were very pained by being told the computer can't draw your densely well-defined neighborhood accurately. For instance, I have an Orthodox Jewish community in my district that is very well defined with its own schools and its own walking patterns, and they were told, well, we can't help you with our computer system. We cannot define your neighborhood. That's a message. And then they were told by a senator, who shall go nameless, well, if you're unhappy, afterwards you can just move to be de-annexed. Well, an individual homeowner trying to be de-annexed, or 6 homeowners, is going to be an unusual burden. But I want to highlight this issue for the committee because it's a cost factor, but it's a real factor that we need to understand.
That's true, and that I can imagine being frustrating because de-annexation is not always, as we discussed in our last meeting, you have to meet certain criteria in order to be de-annexed. And if your neighborhood happens to be one in which it's not on the periphery of the city, then you can't do it because that would create an unincorporated island right in the middle, and it's really not something that's available to you.
These folks are on the periphery,
okay,
but I still
it's limited.
They were told that, I believe they were given incorrect information. Don't worry about that. You can be de-annexed.
It's a weak solution to it, but like I say, at some point in time, you may want to hear from Brian to speak specifically to that.
The second point, if I may, in relation to the legal opinion, the legal issue that's now at play about what we're terming city lights, you're not suggesting, if I understand it correctly, that a city light may not choose to have limited services. You are suggesting that if there is an additional process other than simply a majority vote of the city council to have or not have a service, that raises the constitutional issue because there's a transfer of power. Is that your position?
Let me see if I can maybe say it a different way to make sure we're together. I think a city has all the power. Every city has all the powers it's possible to have. Whether the city chooses to exercise those is within the city's ambit of doing that. I mean, they need to style their services to meet the needs of their people, and they may not have a need, even though they have the power to provide it, that service or that whatever. They don't need to. So they could be a city light by choice. Where I think the problem comes is how we characterize when we say you cannot provide services under these powers unless you have a referendum authorizing you to operate under that. If we characterize that as a removal of that power, then I think it is maybe a constitutional problem there, because the law of the Constitution says you cannot do that by local law. You must, any restrictions on those powers must be done by general law, and then you can't remove that power totally under the supplementary powers of the Constitution. But again, the opposite side of that is we didn't remove it. We gave you those powers. We just set a procedural hurdle, if you will, that must be overcome in order to do that, which to me, I don't see a material distinction between requiring a supermajority to exercise the power, which I think most people say, yes, you could put in a supermajority requirement for a vote on various things, and saying the supermajority vote now has become a referendum of the people.
I think I understand it better now. That's very helpful. But I'm having, now that I understand it, to the extent I understand it, I'm having trouble seeing how it would really raise problems, because the powers are there.
Yes.
They're choosing how they wish to exercise those powers. And that's constitutional.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Chairman Taylor?
So, Jeff, just to clarify, and then
Yep.
Each creation of a city and the charters are very different. So, constitutionally allowed, but the powers really go to the charter. The charter is the the guiding document that says these are the powers we choose, or.
Actually, I don't recall.
I'm not an attorney, but I'm asking.
Representative Taylor, I don't recall having drafted a charter. I'm sitting here racking my brain. That doesn't have what I call a catch-all provision, and it's usually the last item. Well, there's usually a section in almost every charter I've ever seen or drafted that has an enumeration of powers that the city will have and may exercise. And the last one is always, these are not to be limiting, but shall be, we intend this city to have all the powers of any city that could ever have under the Constitution and laws of the state of Georgia. And since you're dealing with a charter being a local law version, now, and on the hierarchy of laws that we recognize in determining what trumps what, in here you have local laws occupy one of the lowest rungs on the totem pole. Then a general law will always trump a local law, and the Constitution will always trump a general law. And the Constitution is the document from which cities and counties in Georgia derive their supplementary powers and what they can do. And that's a very broad thing. So I think once you create a city, anything that's restricted down in that local charter that is not consonant with what's in the Constitution is going to get overridden anyway. So that's why I think they get the powers no matter what, if you put in the charter. But you're right. Ordinarily, the charter is their governing document that determines how they operate.
And it's generally accepted, just from experience that, in a referendum, that people accept the terms of the charter.
Yeah. And I think it's a fair assertion that people do look at the charter to see kind of what's going on, but you have to bear in mind, though, the legal concepts that could.
That's legal and political, so I got you.
Chairman Ed Rinders.
Thank you, and thank you, Jeff. I want to drill down a little bit on some of the things that's been said.
Sure.
Is there a definition of city lighting code?
No.
So that would really be up to determination of whatever they think that term means.
Yes, sir. It's just the common term that we've in the lexicon to refer to something that you hopefully will have less than the full services.
Right. Do you know anything, any legislative intent that's ever been spoken of as it relates to the definition of city light?
I think that city light, like any other non-legally defined term, takes on a kind of general understanding among members, but it's probably much like beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Right. Thank you so much for that. A lot of times up here in my world, I remember our good friend Tom Bordeaux used to be chairman of Judiciary and would go to the well a couple times a year and talk about it's not constitutional. And he'd be right X amount of times, and then he'd go, see, I told you. Because we don't, I think you mentioned you never know what the courts are going to do.
Yes, sir.
So if it's not in code of what creates a particular new city, if that's kind of, has legislative council, to your knowledge, ever passed any kind of general law or local law that you question the constitutionality of? For example?
Anytime we would create the city light concept, we've ordinarily provide a letter that we have something.
Right. So you've cautioned people.
Yes, sir.
Have you cautioned people in the past on any of the recently created cities, the Sandy Springs, the list? Have you cautioned anybody that you know of, that has your office cautioned anybody that you may have some legal concerns about that?
You put me in a difficult position, Representative Reinders, because of my
Well, I understand.
Let me just say,
the reason why is because if now that's brought up, if it's now brought up that this could be problematic, I just think it's fair to ask, has it been brought up that it may be problematic in the past?
we routinely caution people about matters that we have constitutional concerns about. Can I leave it at that?
Yes, you may. And that, because I'm trying to wrap my mind around people's definition of what a service is,
Yes,
which
sir.
has been a concern of mine, and the logic and an analytical thought process that says we're going to say you have to have 200 people. That's clearly defined, right?
That's correct.
But we're not going to do anything if you currently don't have 200 people.
By statute, you cannot, yes, sir. Create a city.
And logically, I would think that that could be questioned in court. Because you can question anything.
Oh, certainly.
And then we would get into that definition of legislative intent.
Yes, the old law school question, who can sue whom for what? And the real answer is anybody can sue anybody for anything. Whether you can win or not is the real question.
So, as it relates to Intergovernmental Coordinations Committee or governmental affairs, we set rules by the House,
Yes, sir.
that say you must have 2/3 on local legislation for certain kind of votes on the House floor, as opposed to simple majority, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so I'm sitting there trying to determine how do we legally say that the rules that we have in place in intergovernmental coordination, or the interpretation of those rules, that all we can do is to establish those rules, and if someone, just like any other general bill, doesn't like it, then there is a process for that,
Yes, sir.
which would be going to court, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so I'm trying to find the balance. If we try to maintain some kind of sense of order, in other words, this is the process. It has to be the first year. You have to get a feasibility study. You have to do this, and you have to do that. If that's done, and it's done even-handedly, which is my goal, then what else can we do? What else would you recommend?
Again,
We're not picking winners and losers politically.
Right. You're pushing me over in the area of policy somewhat, which I'm not fully comfortable in.
Right.
Let me just.
And that's kind of my point on some of the other statements. If it's do this, do that, I'm sitting there going, there's a process, and if we ain't been warning people.
Yeah. Let me say this. You know, the situation you're talking about is a rule of a committee of the General Assembly. Consequently, it is only applicable to matters that come before that committee. For instance, and I'm not suggesting this would happen, but I'm just using this as an example of what I'm going toward. If the Speaker had a bill be introduced and first read dealing with the creation of a new city, and he chose to send that to Judiciary, there would be no rule in play whatsoever, and Judiciary could do whatever they chose to do. Then once it came back to the floor, of course, I think you may have the right to, stand up and say, well, that just didn't follow our procedure, that shouldn't have been there, and so forth, and raise Cain. And perhaps you carry the day, perhaps you don't on the situation. The same thing is true if you go to the Senate. All bets are off, because I don't recall any Senate committee that has any rule whatsoever on this particular issue. The way I think to deal with it is one of two ways. I think it needs to be elevated higher so it becomes a rule of the body as opposed to a rule of the committee, or that you pass legislation that says very similar to the retirement standards law, which sets forth a statutory procedure by which we will create cities. Now, I don't know, if y'all want to go down this road or not. When the Senate committee met Tuesday, a lot of discussion mentioned and went into things on other ways by which cities could be created, and there's a good bit of study that committee is doing in looking into alternative methods of creating cities other than through legislative enactment. You may want to just get the process away from you altogether, set up standards by which it can be done, set up a commission or some other methodology by which people get, cities, and just rid yourself of it totally, and therefore you'll have a set of rules, and if they meet them, they become cities. If they don't meet them, they don't become cities. Those would be my suggestions, Mr. Chairman.
Let me continue, if I may, Madam Chair.
Please.
My concern has been, even going back to the annexation,
Yes, sir.
I am 100% on board that these 11 criteria, that's not defined. Me and you had a discussion afterwards that said I'm not proposing that the state define what a library is.
Yes, sir.
Or garbage. The Municipal Association, in discussions that I've had with them, we've talked about, well, does a library mean you come in a truck once a month? Okay?
Yes, sir.
But I think what I did say was, as a way of tightening it, was shouldn't, and I think you had some concern about how vague the legal definitions were in their ads that they put out.
Yes, sir.
I'm trying to raise the standards. Couldn't those standards be raised as a part of a solution, be the fact that the people have the right to exactly know what they're going to get and have that defined locally? Wouldn't that up the standards in your mind than a generic, I think your definition last time was by rule of change of charter, was almost that vague?
Yeah.
Don't you think that would up the standard if we were more clear of exactly what the people were going to get and the cost associated with that?
Conceptually, I think I agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If we have no further questions of the committee,
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee.
I hope you'll stay with us. We may have questions at the end. All right. Thank you, Jeff. At this time, I'd like to call on Tom Gell and Susan Moore with the Georgia Municipal Association.
Madam Chair, I'm tempted to try to let Ted go first because I'm really interested in hearing what he has to say since some of it's on point to what esteemed councilor just brought up.
Okay. Well, stay with us. You'll hear it.
Yes, I will. Members of the committee, my name is Tom Gale. I'm with the Georgia Municipal Association, and I'm with Susan Moore, our general counsel. We appreciate you all taking the time to have us here today. We will be brief. GMA doesn't have an extensive policy position on new cities. We've been watching from the sidelines and watching the process as it potentially could impact our existing cities, but we haven't been actively supporting or opposing the efforts of the city of movements that have been percolating across the state. But I think essentially the discussion of incorporation is about the concept that people really care where they live and they want a responsive and responsible local government. The discussions about whether or not we should create a new city surface when these citizens are not receiving the kinds of services that they think that they need, or if they're not feeling adequately represented by a county government. And citizens should have the ability to petition for a government that will be more responsive to their needs. And if a county is not meeting their needs, it's I think right for the citizens to have concerns with that. They can petition their county for a higher level of service or to be more responsive. And if they don't get that, they should have the option to consider talking about cityhood as an option. Financial viability of cities, which you all have required, is a very good thing. It's important to know that when these new cities are created, that they're going to be financially stable. One thing that I think was just touched on by Mr. Lanier, the creation of a new city is a local political process. It's the people in those areas that want to potentially form a new city. And you have rules in place, both through the Intergovernmental Coordination Committee and the Government Affairs Committee. But it may be worthwhile to discuss whether or not clear statutory guidelines related to the process of the General Assembly are in place, such as, and I think Jeff mentioned this, treating cityhood proposals like a retirement bill, where they have to be, statutorily have to be filed on the first year of the term and receive a fiscal study that is presented at the second year for consideration by the General Assembly. I think that this kind of statutory guidelines will provide a clearer process, and I think that's some of the consternation that we've seen by some of these citizen groups that are trying to work their potential proposals through the General Assembly process. That will help provide a little bit of clarity to them as they try to figure out how things work under the gold zone. Also, because it is a fundamentally local political decision, not necessarily a statewide political issue, allowing locals to manage and control the outcome of these processes would be less contentious. I think Ted's going to mention in a few minutes, I'm definitely not going to steal his thunder, but according to the research that the Carl Vinson Institute has done, Georgia is only one of 7 states that require the legislature's approval of new cities. So we're in a minority when it comes to the ability of the citizens to have that self-determination as an option. Some states require the approval of specially created boundary commissions. Some states provide a mechanism to secure a number of signatures of electors in a particular area and submit a petition to a court, which would then be voted on by a geographically fixed area. Ted will go through some of the specific details, but I think that's something for you all to consider. The petition process, it may be cumbersome, but it does provide you all with another option for your citizens. I think it's important to keep in mind that the General Assembly, as you know, will always retain power to make decisions about incorporations at the state capitol. You all will have the plenary power to decide whether or not a city's going to be in existence. You can yank charters, et cetera, if you so choose. But that other process would be a process that would allow for a grassroots effort and self-determination, in addition to the process of petitioning members of the General Assembly for the creation of a new city. With that, Madam Chair, we would like to be a resource through this process, and be glad to try to answer any questions if there are.
Representative Oliver has a question.
So there's a 100% method to be annexed. Is there a 100% method to be de-annexed?
Basically, the process for de-annexation works where the first thing you have to do is get the county commission. You have to be on the border of the particular city. But the first thing you have to do is get the county commission to approve of you coming out of the city. And once you petition the county commission votes to accept your de-annexation petition, then you have to get the city council to do the same thing.
So it's not exactly the same. It's slightly different than the de-annexation method from the annexation method. But
it's basically 100%
agreement by both sides.
Right. And keep in mind, in both annexation and de-annexation processes, you're always in the county, and so you've got different obligations for a city resident versus.
Second question, and I'll ask this same question to Mr. Baggett. If we decided statutorily to require a 2-year period like retirement and statutorily require a fiscal impact, how would you allow exceptions as the map changes to the fiscal impact study? There's a lot of consternation that when a map changes after this fiscal study, and particularly it's going to change most significantly in commercial areas, how are you going to define that exception? Because right now we're ignoring that reality as we move forward with map changes.
Well, and Susan can weigh in on this too, but I know that's a conundrum, and I think that maybe the fiscal actuarial studies that are done for retirement bills will give you some insight into how a retirement bill can be changed in the second term after a study's been created. I don't know enough about that particular process, but that may be instructive to you all in determining what kind of date certain in which boundaries are locked based on fiscal studies. But again, it's a political process here at the Capitol, and that's why the maps and the borders change, not necessarily because of a process locally that establishes the border. So it's a conundrum. I don't know if we have a specific good answer for it, but that's something that we know is an issue moving forward.
Thank you, Representative Oliver. Now I'd call on Chairman Runders.
Thank you. Do a little drilling down. Did you say Georgia's one of only 7 states that allowed for self-determination?
No, that require the General Assembly to be involved in the creation of a new city.
And our process allows for self-determination?
The General Assembly's process?
Yeah, because it is a referendum.
Well, at the end of the day, But I guess the point is, in order to even get to the point of a referendum, they have to get legislation through the General Assembly.
And I want to talk about that a little bit. As we know, some things are always overtly political, right, wrong, or indifferent. We can watch an election in Fulton County and talk about how that changes the makeup, which could affect local legislation, right? The same thing happens, we know, all across the country and all across the state with commissions. It can affect things like consolidated governments, the way redistricting is done. So if we're looking at the political ramifications sometimes that affects citihoods, counties, can you give me a method via a commission or something else that would take the politics out of it?
Well, again, I would think that Mr. Baggett, who will speak in a few minutes, he's done extensive research about the different methods that other states have employed to try to tackle that issue. And I would defer to his research. We haven't really gone into any detail internally about how to...
And the point is that there's going to be people that I don't care what you do, they're a no. And what you do, they're a yes. And if they're appointed, the other side's going to sit there and go, it was loaded, it's not fair anyway. I mean, and so if we're trying to deal with that, I don't know if we'll ever reach 100% of kind of, for lack of a better way of making it happy. And as it relates to the changing of the map after and what kind of impact that would have on the viability of it, do you agree that there could be a scenario where someone wants to quickly change a map? Maybe it's Miss Oliver's Jewish community that wouldn't have virtually any impact on the financial viability of it, but would do it because it was simply just a mistake, and we would want that kind of wiggle room then, wouldn't we?
And I would argue you all retain that
right,
that plenary power to decide.
And as it relates to reapportionment and their data, if someone came in and drew a map that inadvertently, and I think this happened, dealt with parcels, then wouldn't we want to be able to have that wiggle room to make a correction instead of someone going through a whole new process of 2 other years, when some people would try to bring up those points for the sole purpose of delaying it because they're a simple no. And they're going to use those kind of rules and those kind of mechanisms to delay the right to self-determination. Do you think those kind of scenarios could happen?
It sounds like you know of which you speak.
Do you think they happen, Tom? Do you think people do pull those out of... Do we have parcel discussions? And people do that. And you're like, well, it's really not about they're trying to delay the process. And that's why we need the wiggle room as members of the General Assembly, because we're human beings and sometimes just mistakes things or happen, or you didn't know that school was split or this or that, and we want to be responsive and good people. So people game the system for and against sometimes. And I just think that at the end of the day, we need the wiggle room to make those inadvertent corrections. So thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Reinders. And next we have Representative Beskins.
Mr. Gale, good morning. You stated at the outset that GMA has not formulated an extensive policy regarding new cities. At our first meeting earlier this month, we were presented with policy positions, an extensive set of policy positions set forth by ACCG. Most of the ones on the first page relate to annexation, but on the back page there are some that relate to new cities. I'd like to ask if you have a position on these. It says, furthermore, ACCG urges the General Assembly to reject any legislation that would require that infrastructure investments made by county taxpayers be transferred to new municipalities that are created. In addition, since the creation of new cities will likely have implications for all citizens of a county, the incorporation of new cities should be dependent on a countywide vote in addition to a vote within the proposed corporate boundaries. So I ask whether GMA has a position on those. Is it neutral? Might it revisit these positions?
Well, I'm sure that if we were to bring ACCG's policies to our policy process in our committees, we probably would have a different set of opinions. But until the General Assembly is introducing legislation that would affect those particular policies that would become law, then it will make us have to come to a decision. But I would guess that we have some real differing points of view. Oh, thanks.
Okay. And so it's on the page 2, the first full paragraph under the bullet points. Where it talks about ACCG's position of any infrastructure transferred to the new city, and requiring a vote countywide rather than just in the area that would be incorporated.
Well, I mean, I guess my first thought is that would be a hurdle that would be very difficult to overcome. Imagine if you've got a quarter of a, or 20% of an area that wants to become annexed. You require the entire county to vote. I think it'd be problematic, or at least very difficult for you to have a incorporation vote that's successful, where the county as a whole has to approve of that incorporation.
Right. I was trying to limit my question to not in cases of annexation, but incorporation of new cities. And I think there are, I'm new at this and I'm just learning, but I've heard of examples of implications for the complete county when you have the incorporation of a city, for example, on legacy costs. So I would think that perhaps everyone in the county would have an interest in incorporation of new areas.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, and I think Susan wants to speak, and I think that there is a discussion about whether or not financial studies that are done for new cities should also incorporate potential revenue losses to the county, but also the expectation that the service responsibilities for counties go down and that the savings will accrue. And I think that certainly that impact to a county, both in reduction in costs, because the services that they provide, municipal services that they provide, are reduced. But I think that's a fair approach. But to have a hurdle of a county-wide vote for a small number of people in the community who want to be served by government closest to them is going to be a very difficult hurdle for them to overcome.
I can understand your position. It just sounds now like GMA does have a position on some of these issues.
I'm speculating
right.
about what
right.
we would have to bring ACCG's policy position,
okay.
But we haven't done that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Next we, just one second. Next we have Chairman Taylor.
Just on a follow-up to Representative Beskin's question, the statute that actually established a lot of that was HB 205 in 2010 with the property transfers between counties and cities, which basically said that the residents of this area, this particular area, whatever it may be, I think it started with Sandy Springs, have been a part of this tax base for X number of years and have contributed to such, and at a nominal fee can accept, can take over county properties that exist within those cities, and that's I believe it was HB 205 in 2010, just for reference.
Essentially, if I understand you, Chairman Taylor, you're assuming that those people have already paid for that infrastructure as county residents, and therefore they shouldn't have to pay for it again.
Correct. As somebody municipalizes, if they do, that those assets have been paid for over a period of 20, 30 years, whatever the bond structure is, whatever, that they can assume that as and there's a case going back to College Park, and I believe Susan, 1930 or so, where it was held by the Georgia Supreme Court that those assets having been paid for over X number of years by the city that's separating from a county, basically assume all the debts going forward that have been approved, but can basically transfer those properties to the municipality.
And if I could point out, in the instance of the DeKalb cities that were formed, certainly they explicitly carried forward the obligation to pay back the GO debt that had been incurred for the recreation program, as is eminently appropriate. And the other part of this being supplementary powers, again, the provision in the Constitution that says the county doesn't provide services in a city without an intergovernmental agreement. The city doesn't provide services outside its boundaries. So if the city is going to be taking over the provision of those services, fire, police, other things that are going to require those assets, then they need to work out something for that, because those may not be usable by the county, and the city may need to buy them. Under annexation, there is already provision for that about the purchase of unusable assets. And if I may simply suggest that some of this, the tension we've seen could be worked out if people would communicate and would sit down and work out good faith agreements for some of these transfers, rather than some of the activity we've seen with people stripping parks of all of the amenities and things like that before it gets transferred. So, you know, again, we were at the Senate committee on Tuesday and we talked about annexation, and somebody actually made the comment, a lot of this is common sense, a lot of this is communication, coordination, people sitting down and talking to each other. And I would just like to encourage that as much as possible, as opposed to mandate. I would like to see the local governments work out among themselves how best to move forward.
Chairman Reinders.
Quick points. I couldn't agree with you more. I get so frustrated for 10 years that you and the County Association of County Commissioners don't do that more or better. One of the problems that I'm having, Tom, and I really don't know what to do with it, is it's easy to sit there and go, well, you know, they're not getting services from the county. And I've seen that. I know it's true, or they feel that way, real or imagined. I've talked to some officials and say, you know, you have some ownership in that perception. What hasn't been talked about is that there's areas, and frankly, a lot of times, y'all, they're more affluent areas, and they feel like they're being gorged tax-wise. But you know what? They also don't want to be part of that city because they're not viewed favorably either. And so, you know, the city that, if they annex in, because if we're saying the county's dysfunctional, a lot of times that city sitting right there is viewed by those same people as dysfunctional. And so they come and they say, our only recourse is to let us do it our way. And I wondered if that's part of the reason why, just a little part, if that's part of the reason why it's hard not to necessarily take a position on the creation of new cities, because I would think, since you represent cities, the more the better. But is it because sometimes it may be making a statement that they want to be separate from a currently existing statement? Does that cause you any political heartburn from time to time, or do you sit there and go, you know, at the end of the day, there's a process and let's just stay out of it? Why would you want to create more cities?
Well, I think one of the challenges, and again, Ted may touch on this, is that we have Mayor Paul here from Sandy Springs. When Sandy Springs was voted on, it was 90. I've got the numbers here. 90%, just through the roof. Everybody wanted to be in the city. Since that time, the percentage margin of victory of these new cities has slowly gone down until I think Brookhaven was 54-point-something%. So I don't know if this is really answering your question the way I think you want to answer, but
I just wanted to answer honestly. Why wouldn't you support more cities since you represent cities? That has always been a little perplexing to me.
Well, we are supportive of letting people decide for themselves what government is appropriate for them, and we don't want to impose our view of what's appropriate for them. It's their role working with them, et cetera. But we do want whatever is created, whatever new city is created, to be a viable city, one that's not dysfunctional. Sure, cities have in counties.
Right.
Every government goes through dysfunctional periods of time, but we want it to be a viable city that is robust and as Jeff said, has the ability one day to soar and become the service provider of all the services that are listed in the supplemental powers and provisions of the Constitution. So we wish them success, but we're not, our big concern is that we don't want a city just stumble into existence and then collapse because they don't have the cohesion.
All right, thank you.
Representative Beskins.
To follow up on Chairman Reiner's question about feasibility or viability studies, we're focusing on a proposed or purported new city doing a feasibility study that they will be feasible as a city. But should there be any obligation for that city to do a feasibility study of whether what they are leaving left in the county could also be a feasibility study? It's kind of like a game of musical chairs, and a group of people doesn't want to be the last person without a chair. So should there be an obligation for what's left to have to meet a feasibility study also?
Well, I guess short answer, again, that may be a better question for the Fiscal Research Center or the Edward Andrew Young or Carl Benson, because they're the ones who actually do the studies. And right now, the House Committee requires a study. And the rules basically say that the area to be incorporated has to do studies. And there's no fund at the General Assembly. The Department of Community Affairs doesn't give money to different areas that want to incorporate. These folks, by the worn out heels and the sweat of their brow, go out and raise money, $25,000, $30,000, I forget what the going rate is. And county governments with the majority, with a higher fiscal capacity than some of these neighborhoods and communities of interest, they could potentially do what Cat County did with hiring Georgia Tech to do a study of viability for their own interests. But I think until there's a pot of money that would be required from a county government to do a study through these resources, I think it's right now you're getting the money by the shoelaces from these communities to do these studies. And you want to require them to also raise an X amount more to do a study for areas outside. That's a policy decision, but it's throwing another obstacle or hurdle on those people who want self-determination.
And if I might add, with respect to that, I guess being in an area where this has been going on, I've always been curious as to why there's no question about what the county should be doing when these people want to leave. Why aren't they going to them and talking to them and saying, what's wrong, what's the matter? I understand the fiscal feasibility on all these sides and the burdens and requirements of local government. But again, it comes down to communication. It's one thing I have not seen is, and I haven't seen anybody asking it of the counties, is if somebody wants to incorporate, well, maybe you should go find out why and talk to them, before this goes on. And we do all understand there's a lot of politics at issue, but still, it seems like everybody wants to put the responsibility on the people that want to incorporate and none on the existing government.
Representative Oliver.
This is a helpful discussion around the issue of policy, discussion about feasibility study. Senator Parent and I, when she was in the House, introduced legislation that required feasibility study to do an analysis of county loss too. And I think that that's going to be an important part for us to discuss. I agree that it's a totally political process and there are people who are yes and people who are no, but I'm more concerned about the people, vast majority of people who are in the middle, who are trying to figure out what's going on with behind the door politics. It's behind the door politics that we have an obligation to address in some affirmative way. And that's why this discussion is helpful. What should a feasibility study cover? When should it cover it? And what are the exceptions that give politicians who want to retain the power some power, but also tell the public that we have a process that they can respect. And that's an important part of this discussion. That's why this is very helpful. And let me close with this. I will ask, you don't have to tell me right now, but Council Member Taylor from Dunwoody and Mayor Paul from Sandy Springs, would Dunwoody and Sandy Springs been created if the voters of DeKalb and Fulton had had a right to veto it by their comprehensive county vote?
No.
The trick there.
No. Well, and to respond to you, I think the other thing that I think you might have left out is besides what the feasibility study should cover, the fiscal study, is where does the money come from? Right now, both my alma mater, UGA, and Providence Institute, and my other one, my grad school alma mater, Georgia State, they're the only, according to House rules, the only institutions that are approved to be studied, but they ask for money for these studies. And who's going to pay for it? And I think that the petition from the public to a Superior Court, if that process is something that y'all want to explore, perhaps that trigger also triggers a specific fund or expenditure that creates a study that is robust enough to help not only you.
I'll only speak for myself. And I don't presume to speak for anybody. The advocacy groups that want a new city should pay for it, period. The taxpayers should not pay for this particular advocacy group who want to carry the day in their political campaign, it's a political process, to create a new city. That'd be my answer.
Thank you. Chairman Taylor.
Couldn't agree more. I know with Mayor Paul and myself, in creating these, we raised the money privately, did that, and all. With regard to the revenues lost and the effect of the county, I'll just from my own experience, the big argument, and I spent 3 years in front of the Governmental Affairs Committee with you sitting on it. $25 million loss to the county every year from the incorporation of Dunwoody. The offset of that is the county's not providing a lot of the services. That the cities have taken that over, so that's not quite a wash, but it's very close to a wash because yes, it is a net revenue loss to the county, but again, they're not providing a lot of services that are high value services like police and things like that. So,
Thank you. Chairman Reinders. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more, Ms. Moore, as it relates to the conversation. But as you know, the cities would be saying the exact same thing. The people who want to be de-annexed are sitting there going, if they'll just listen to me. Because at this level, we don't know what kind of communication is happening at the local level, whether it's someone wanting to be incorporated or de-annexed. But I wanted to get your opinion on something. There's been some discussion. I support and agree with the 2-year timetable for incorporation. I wanted to get your thoughts, and if you want time to talk to your members, I get that. But I'm trying to figure out why necessarily it has to be done in the first year. Because I can make an argument that we're about to enter our second year, and if somebody wanted to look at a cityhood initiative and do a feasibility study, there's a part of me that goes, the reason why they need that time is to be able to get the information back, to be able to raise their funds, and so forth and so on. Why would it matter if it's 2 years when it happens first year versus the second year? Because they could get that done and then have a bill ready to go at another point. And so just, unless you know off the top of your head, I just want you to...
I would just suggest that's a decision that you all would have to discuss.
Do you see off the top of your head a problem with that?
I don't.
Okay.
The only, and I'm, of course, Councilor Lanier could chime in, but the only thing is, of course, if you introduce a bill after the end of the 2-year term, it's dead. Does that affect the ability or the viability of a study or a process? I would imagine you all could craft any kind of statute.
Yeah, the bill would obviously be dead. We all know that. But that doesn't keep the work from going on.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Chairman Taylor.
And having been through this process from literally the ground zero to the formation of a city, I was frustrated. We took 3 years to get Dunwoody through the General Assembly, but I think, and this is going to seem probably, different than the views I had when I was on the other side of this, is the 3 years it took really got people informed, really got people to knowing what was in, what was out. It was well defined when it passed. I think if you look at some of the vote results, Sandy Springs, I think 96%, Dunwoody 80, north of 85. This is a serious obligation for the General Assembly to take on. Particularly, most of the incorporations have been the metro counties, which have been 14th, 15th, 16th largest cities in Georgia, north of 50,000 people. This is a serious obligation. And I think, although I was frustrated when I was doing it, I think it was well vetted by the time that the people had a chance to vote on it. Just an observation.
I think that's a very valid observation. Rome wasn't built in today, and neither was the slate of new cities we've seen since Sandy Springs started the ball rolling.
Politically stopped for years.
A long time.
Right. That was politically stopped for years.
And if I can, in memory of him, the original Dunwoody deal was dropped in 1971 by Representative Harry Geisinger.
Thank you, Tom. At this time, I'm going to call on Craig Foster with Governmental Affairs to answer a question.
Thank you. I was just going to clarify the point for Chairman Rinder's question. Austin Scott came up with the 2-year rule when he was Chairman of Governmental Affairs. He and I were discussing it at the time. We couldn't have contemplated what was going to happen afterwards, and so he just wanted to model the rule after the retirement rule. As to why it has to be the first year of a biennium and then into a second, we just never thought of what was going to happen. So there's no real rationale why it has to be that way. It was just a 2-year process is what we had in mind.
And Madam Chair, my only point was if a community wanted to have time to get their work done, I almost don't know if the time really matters.
Thank you, Chairman Reinders.
Thank you.
Okay, if we have no further questions or comments from the committee, we'll move on to our next presenter.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Susan. At this time, I'd like to call on Jim Grubiak and possibly others from the Association County Commissioners of Georgia.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for allowing us to be here today. With me is Van Stevens. Stevens is the Chief Assistant County Attorney for Gwinnett County, and is very knowledgeable about the process of new corporations, city life in particular, and what it takes to make all that work after the city was created. I'm just going to make a couple of general comments, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Stevens specifically about continuing the discussion about city life a little bit, service delivery in particular, service agreements, what the implications are there, how do you implement all of that, and the time it takes to get a city up and running and working on a functional basis after that. So my comments basically are that you understand the interest in great new cities. There's compelling reasons some folks have for doing that, the cycle rule or some make all very appropriate reasons for doing it. There's no argument that there are some very fine cities in the state of Georgia. And there's no reason why new cities can also be very fine cities, and we've seen some good ones in Dunwoody, for example. So there's no reason to assume that there shouldn't be new commercial. But it does come at a price, crazy. And there are people affected other than people that live in the new city. Certainly at most basic level, the new city residents now have additional level of government they have to deal with, to compensate government services. Whether it's the 3 minimum services, or the 10 or 15 or 20, whatever number the city might eventually provide, there's still the other 20 or 30 or 40 services that the county provides still they're affected by. So it does complicate that relationship. And it does come at that price, but also it's not just a newly incorporated system. You have the unincorporated system. If the county is deferred from other folks today, the county itself is affected by it. The General Assembly is affected by it. People who are here, especially all are affected by it, for it to be very contentious. And sometimes those city residents, new city residents, are affected later if their taxes were higher than they were anticipating. So if you have the city light as the promise, it turns out it's not city light, it's unfortunately higher. So all those are impacts that are there. So those impacts, they'll vary depending on what the services that are provided by the city, what the services the county is providing, what the level of services, all those become affected. My notes here, I started putting notes on the back of this. I can't read my own handwriting here, folks. I was listening and writing at the same time, so that's a problem. So so on several levels you see issues from the county's perspective. On service delivery, that's going to be the heart of it. What happens in the delivery of services by the county? What they were providing previously, what they're providing now. And don't forget that counties are not flip sides of the same coin. The counties are subdivisions of the state. Counties provide state services and are mandated. Dozens of services that they're mandated to provide. On behalf of the state. Cities are not subdivisions of the state. So whether it's the smallest county in the state or the largest, they all provide the same mandated services as subdivisions of the state. Then they also provide many other services, the same ones that cities can provide. There's very few that cities are mandated to provide, but in that arena where there's some discretion, the counties have that same discretion to provide services to the city. So it's in that context that we have issues that have to be addressed when there is a new city created. Who's going to be doing what? What's going to cost? Where do the revenues flow after the new city is created? There are some revenues that automatically are transferred from the county to the city. There are some that have to be negotiated at some point in time, like local option sales tax. There's some that, by operational law, may wind up going to the city, depending on circumstances like cost, population base, performance fees. All of those are the complexities of what has to be dealt with when a new city is created. And I guess maybe that's a good point for me to turn it over to Van, because he's had to experience this in Gwinnett County when Peachtree Corners was created. Again, that was the city light, and he can address specifically the city light issue, but also what that means in terms of making that work in Gwinnett County.
I was going to go into a lot of detail on the legal provisions around city light, and a lot of that's already been covered very well, so I won't rehash it. I will state that several attorneys around the state, and local government attorneys around the state, have looked at the issue of a limited service fee for a city light. And you're correct, there is no definition of that. But what we found is that the concept of a city light or a limited service fee is unconstitutional. It's also, in many respects, not practical. The reason that
I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you please turn the mic and speak into the mic?
Okay,
we'll
thanks.
hear you a little better. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? The concept of city light is unconstitutional in many respects, not practical. From a constitutional standpoint, the supplementary powers provision of the Constitution provides that counties and cities have supplementary powers, a long list of them, regardless of a piece of legislation. What the city-like concept tries to do, and I'll use Peachtree Corners as an example of the charter in this case. The charter for Peachtree Corners, first, it did not have a statement of intent in the charter itself on the city-like question. It did begin by giving the city a long list of powers, 3 or 4 pages, and it said that those powers were authorized subject to another section within the charter, and the other section said that the city could only exercise 3 powers, and those were planning and zoning, code enforcement, and solid waste management. It also had another provision that said that in order to exercise additional powers, the city had to pass a resolution and then have a referendum for those powers to be exercised. That provision, those provisions that I've just described are in contravention of the supplementary powers law. The Constitution provides that cities and counties have that long list of powers, and it says that the General Assembly cannot withdraw those powers. It can, by general law, restrict them. I'll use a few words there to talk about that. The problem that has been adequately addressed at this point is that a city charter is not a general law. It's a local act, and so it's not authorized there. There's also a procedural problem with the type of scenario that I've described for a city-like, in that the city-like concept provides that if additional powers are to be exercised, there has to be this resolution and referendum. There's currently a general law on the subject of municipal exercise of home rule powers, and it provides contrary means of a city determining amendments to a charter, that type of thing. The local act is not authorized. The general law on the subject has preempted that field. And so for those 2 reasons, the concept of city-like has constitutional problems and has validity problems. It also has practical problems that are just as great. A lot of times, because a city-like is going to be limited service, there's a provision in the charter that only authorizes a millage rate of a certain amount, caps the millage rate. In Peachtree Corners case, it was a 1 mil cap. If additional powers are necessary, it's necessary for that city to exercise additional powers. Just take up, for instance, that the 3 powers that we've talked about are in play: planning and zoning, code enforcement, and solid waste. And say that there is a major stormwater issue in the new city that is very expensive, blows out a road, and goes beyond the road. That's something that will immediately affect the citizens. The city, it can be argued, does not have the ability to fix that stormwater issue, at least until the next session of the General Assembly, or until this can be brought, something can be done about it. There are also provisions in the Constitution that provide, in the supplementary powers provision and elsewhere, that in order for a city to contract with a county for a service such as that there has to be an intergovernmental agreement. And there's also another provision that says that in order to have an intergovernmental agreement, you have to be talking about a power that both of the jurisdictions have. In this case, it could be argued that the city-like does not have the power to exercise that stormwater authority. And that's just one example. There are many. You could go down the list of the different powers that are enumerated in a charter, and you could have a problem with any of those. And there's a question as to whether you could actually fix something that needed to be fixed in the fashion that needed to be fixed. So for those reasons, there are serious problems with a city-like concept, and that's been set forth in a lot of detail in the 2 legal opinions that you have in your packet. And I see that you guys have read those and taken a hard look at them. There are also some other practical effects of the creation of the city light. One of those is in the service delivery area. First of all, the Service Delivery Strategy Act has a provision that if a new city is created, it can trigger a renegotiation of your service delivery strategy. That even though it's a city light and the city light is not providing a lot of services, it may have extreme consequences for the other jurisdictions that have been participating in that service delivery strategy. Having gone through it, I feel like that as a precursor to the incorporation of new cities, the question of service delivery needs to be studied and looked at first. I think that will flesh out a lot of the issues as to who is going to be able to provide a service, any of them, roads, stormwater, whatever the service is. I think that would be very helpful to do that. Another problem with the city light concept is that these acts require a referendum in the question of creation of the city. The cities, the voters within the area that's going to be affected are told that there's going to be a 1 mil cap, or there's going to be some cap on the millage rate, there's going to be some cap on the service, some limit on the services that are provided. If it turns out that the city light is unconstitutional, a decision to that effect at some point, and not just our opinions on the subject, then a good argument can be made that the voters were under a misconception when they looked at the referendum question. So that's an important one. In addition, if these additional services are then to be provided, there's a question with that millage rate cap, and I can see jurisdictions coming back to the General Assembly and needing to do something about the millage rate cap. So those are all issues that are involved with the city light. We just don't feel like that a local law, a charter, passes constitutional muster in trying to limit the services that are otherwise set forth in the Constitution.
Okay, thank you. So most of the time, the city charters are written by legislative council when it comes before the General Assembly, and it's introduced by a legislator. So what you're saying, though, is that the charter, the city charter, when we're speaking of city lights that we don't have defined in code, that those are local laws when they say that they're only going to provide 3 services, and it somewhat prohibits the use or the implementation of all those other powers that are outlined in the Georgia Constitution.
That's right. It's the exercise. The key word in the Constitution is dealing with exercise of the powers. And even though the charter says that cities are authorized to use the powers, they have the powers, is the way that it's set forth. They are not authorized to exercise those powers, and that's effectively they can't use them without a referendum by the voters, and that also is procedurally correct.
Just clarify for me, because a lot of this is new for me, but explain a little bit more about the home rule and how it impacts the city light and the charter limitations, the city charter limitations.
Specifically, there's a code section, I'll just cite it for the record so you can take a look at it. It's 3653, and it provides presently that a charter remains in force until amended as provided in the section. And basically what the section does, there's 2 different ways to amend the charter. One is for the municipality to do that through home rule powers, and one is through an ordinance, and it goes through a process that you're probably pretty familiar with. The other is through the initiation of a petition. So it sets forth procedurally how a city would go about doing that. The local act that creates a city light has a different provision. But this provision that I was just going through is a matter of general law. The city light provision, which completely is local act that would not control.
Okay, thank you. And you have questions. I'll call on Chairman Reinders first.
Thank you. I've got to tell you, I'm not surprised. I couldn't agree with you more, and that's the drum I've been beating on misleading folks on what they're going to get in exchange for this. And that's, I hear it all the time. I think I was going to get, and that's why I want to de-annex that. That's why I want another city. Promises made, and you can't hold another local authority responsible because they never passed anything for it. So we're 100%. You don't want to mislead. That means there's a but coming. So if you say city light is unconstitutional, if there's not a court case, then isn't that misleading?
No, I don't think so. We don't.
Now, this legal opinion was the word you used.
Yes, and that's true. It's very true. It's opinion. Their studied opinion based on research. There's not a case out there yet.
Has it been ruled unconstitutional? Because it's not even code. I'm just confused on that.
No, it has not been ruled unconstitutional.
Okay.
There hasn't been a case on it yet. But there is a real issue with that I haven't gone through as well, and that is that, let's say that it is ruled unconstitutional. Let's say that...
But it hasn't been ruled unconstitutional, is my point.
Right, that's true.
Okay.
But let's say that an appellate court adopts former Chief Justice Fletcher's opinion that it is unconstitutional. And we're then left with the issue, well, what about that city that's been created? Is that city no more? Or is that city a city with all the powers? Most people that have looked at it feel like probably, and we don't know this, there's no court case on this yet, but probably the city would remain in existence. The city would have all these powers that the Constitution sets forth. It wouldn't be a city light. So that goes back to the question of misrepresentation during the referendum. Both
sides love to do this sometimes, and I try to stay free and clear of all that kind of good stuff. And because one thing I've never heard up here since I've been elected, thank you, I'm fully funded. A lot of times this is always about the money, and I agree. If you're taking something away and it affects the loss, that needs to be considered. If would you say a blowout water problem and they don't have that in there, and I agree, and I sit there and go, so why are they getting LMIG funds? Right? Because they're getting money for something they're not even provided. So that kind of cuts both ways. And the other question I wanted to ask was the intergovernmental agreement, and I've had this discussion with some of my friends at ACCG, and I go, well, I'm just concerned if you don't like the intergovernmental agreement, why are you signing it?
And we have.
Is that a fair question? We're mad about the intergovernmental agreement we just signed.
It takes two to make an agreement. You're absolutely right. And we went through the process. This process with Peachtree Corners. We have actually two big notebooks of intergovernmental agreements that were necessary. A lot of them came into play during the transition period because there was great uncertainty as to who would do what at what time. We have those, and we have intergovernmental agreements that have come into play afterwards. We actually came back to the legislature because we were wrestling with some of these issues because we found it was not practical, and it actually came back to a charter amendment. Your point about the money, we studied the issue before the incorporation and found that in our case that the funds that would be taken from the county were between $12 and $13 million a year, and that's just going to be a function of how large the population is within the new cities. In some cases that are under consideration, it might be a lot more than that. If you look at the services that are provided where that money is being taken from the county, we're talking about a service of planning and zoning that the county already performed, and as we understood it from conversations about the service, performed well. Same with code enforcement.
Well, that's exactly where I was going. Me and you are 100% on the same page. If we have concerns about a new city being created, and ACCG or Gwinnett County or someone else has a problem with that, and they're saying zoning and planning and code enforcement, then why are you signing those agreements to give them that, which allows them to provide the services to make them a city? It seems like to me that you would be able to stop that.
No, actually,
why do you sign the intergovernmental agreement?
Well, actually, it starts, though, in this case with, and we did get into the process when the city was being incorporated. It starts with the local act that incorporates the city. That local act says, county, there's a new city, and that this new city has the power of planning and zoning, if it so chooses. So they have that power. That's not something is not an intergovernmental agreement that's necessary. Some other things we looked at, and just the practical effect of trying to create a limited service city. No one wants the residents of an area to be without a service, or not be served. And there were gaps if a city like that, and it's been stated here, counties can't go into cities can't go into counties without an intergovernmental agreement. There's a new jurisdiction, a new city that's being created. There might just be 3 services, and those 3 services don't cover what's necessary for the citizens of that area. The county, in this situation, wanted to make sure people were covered.
Yes. My point is, I'm doing a terrible job of articulating, and I apologize for that. But I'm just kind of confused on, we're sitting there saying, we don't want these cities to be city-like, and I don't even know what that means, and they're providing these services, and that's just not enough. And I'm sitting there going, but some of those services are the one that you signed the agreement to give them. And that bothers me a little bit. I don't think you can complain about it if your own folks are signing it. Is that illogical?
I don't think it's illogical. I think and whether it's a city like with 3 services or whether
right.
it's a city with 5 services instead of 20.
Don't sign it.
I think it's clear that it does take 2 to sign the agreement, but we also have commissioners who have a different role than what city council has. Commissioners are responsible for the entire county. The constituents of every citizen in that county, whether they live in the city or in the unincorporated area. So if there are problems in a service gap, 2 things might happen. One, no citizens, city residents. If the city's not going to be able to provide that service, they go to the commission. They say, well, where's our whatever that service is? And then the commission, being thoughtful about what needs to be done, will say, well, let's provide that service. How do we do it? We have to have an intergovernmental agreement if we're going to do it. And then that's the next step. So in case of Gwinnett, they had multiple intergovernmental agreements because there were multiple gaps that somebody had to do something for those constituents of the
Finally, Madam Chair, and you're exactly right, and I was waiting on that answer. If you got a 5-member county commission board and 2 of them are affected by Peachtree's Corners in this hypothetical, the other 3 vote and you get the agreement. And that's the exact same thing that happens somewhere else on something else that goes at the detriment of a part of a county that then makes the county turn around and say, you know what, I want a city. Because those people, those 3 commissioners in a different area are sitting there posing their impact on us through zoning and other things, and that's why we need to, it's a chicken and the egg thing sometimes to me. You're right. But that's also what causes some of that to say, I want to become a city. You agree with that?
I'm sure that's an element of uncertainty.
Thank you.
Before we could get into the intergovernmental agreement with the Peachtree Corners case, which is the same type of language being considered in some of these other city-like scenarios, we had to come back to the legislature to amend the charter before we could even do the
I'm sorry, I cut myself off. At this time, I would remind committee members that we're running a little bit long on our time, and this end of the board is lit up, and I'm going to call on each person, each committee member to ask their questions, but let's please keep our comments brief because we do have a public portion of this committee meeting. And at this time, I'll call on Representative Oliver.
Do I understand that Gwinnett is made a decision or not made a decision to bring this issue to court, or has any other party made a decision to bring this issue to court?
No, there's nothing.
Y'all made a decision to come back to the General Assembly to fix it, so you've definitely decided not to litigate it. You're just raising clouds for reasons that I'm confused about.
Now, there is no litigation or any discussion of litigation in that county. Really, we're here because there are city-like concepts that are being considered for creation in the future, and we're talking about should the legislature create another city-like. And looking at the issues, there are some constitutional issues. That's what it is.
There are some right now being considered, being proposed as city-like, and the Forsyth County in particular is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the voters there are being presented with the notion that they will have limited city government. And if this motion is correct and you think that it is, then they are being misled on that point.
And I would add, of course, that we did come back to the legislature on the Peachtree Corner Street.
Next, we have Chairman Taylor.
Not questions, just commentary. Having been through this from, like I said, concept through execution, Service Delivery Strategy Act, all that stuff is really important. I think free advice to anybody going into this is keep your eyes open and be aware of what you're getting into. It's not something taken lightly. To form a municipality is a big deal. To separate yourself from some semblance of county government at the end of the day. And voter information is, you can't sell what you're not going to provide. The IGAs, the biggest point there is, I would say, be aware what you're going into as well with City Light, because some terms, once you become a city, a municipality, and I'm not an attorney or anything, but from experience, the day you become a municipality and you enter into IGAs, those are negotiated agreements at that point. Those are not business as usual. So my example with Dunwoody is when we became a city, we had county police that were required to provide the services for up to 2 years, but the rates changed immediately. And that, is something that is, if you're going in and saying, oh, I've got, a police department, I've got a police station in Dunwoody, that's great. But now they're no longer employed. It's under a separate agreement. And I just would advise anybody that's looking at this to take it very seriously. It's a serious business. Like I said, I spent the past 10 years of my life doing this stuff. And it's not something to be. I hate the term city light, but if you're going to look at it, you need to look at the full scope of services and what you're going to provide and what you're not going to provide at the end of the day.
Thank you. And Representative Beskin.
My questions were anticipated. The first was the right remedy or results if a city light such as Peachtree Corners is ruled to be unconstitutional, and I think the answer I hear from you is we don't know.
That's correct.
And then the other was the question of whether there are any cases in the pipeline regarding city light, and I think the answer is that we don't know. So there are no cases out there that can expedite our determination whether they are unconstitutional or not.
That's right. There's no case on point at this point. The creation of additional cities might lead to litigation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jim, if you'd like
I want
to.
to just comment on a couple of comments. There was some discussion earlier about communication. There was discussion about knowing what you're getting if you're a new resident of the city or if you're an unincorporated resident. Steve has mentioned one possibility of dealing with that kind of service delivery agreement. Perhaps they need to be negotiated in advance in that year period, even if they're just draft service delivery agreements proposed or something that, of course, wouldn't take effect until it needs to be approved. But that would flush out a lot of the costs, because if it was necessary for the new city to have a contract with the county, that would be part of the discussion putting together the service delivery agreement. There's a series of intergovernmental agreements, in essence, how to deal with all the services that the cities are providing in that county and what the county is providing, and who's paying for what and how much. That's the substance of service delivery. So if you were to do that in advance of an actual vote in some period of time before there's a vote, then at least the voters would have a really good sense of what was at stake. It also might help in some of that communication that is more suggested and adult but you should have communicated. You have to know what the facts are. You have to know what the numbers are. You have to know what the effect is. And where we are now, oftentimes, is after the city is created, how do you figure out all those things? And that seems to be backwards. You come into the city, so from your perspective, as well as from the citizens, you need to have that information. And rather than having, a university study sort of guessing at what those costs are based on what somebody else did, time and way work, it's back to explain. And that makes sense given, the point in time when these studies are being done. Why stop at that? Why not actually delve into the relationships in a way that's much more meaningful?
Thank you, Jen. And if we have no further questions or comments, we will call on our next presenter. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. At this time, I'd like to call on Ted Baggett, and he's going to speak to us about the fiscal studies.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Just as a preparatory note to my remarks, I look around the room and see folks who are deeply embedded on either side, city and counties, clients of the Institute of Government. They're both cities and counties associations we both work with, that I've been personal friends with for 15 years. And one of my legislative mentors told me one time that whenever you had a difficult issue and it was controversial and you had really good friends on one side and really good friends on the other side, you just really needed to smile and say, I agree with my friends. So, yeah, a lot of what's been said, I think, gets to the heart of a lot of the difficult policy decisions that y'all are making. I want to be appreciative of your time, and I want to kind of just make a few observations. But I come neither to praise nor bury new cities, but really to talk about the process of incorporation. And that kind of guides my remarks towards what I consider to be a suggestion for y'all to consider in the process. You've already talked about the municipal incorporation standards. I think that they do have to be thought about. I mean, none of the cities we've created in the last 10 years have ever been at risk of not meeting. These are very minimal standards. We've taken some time to look at the processes in different states. Upping the standards is one way of dealing with making sure you've got areas. I mean, different states take very radically different policy stands, and looking at the incorporation standards is one way of that. But I think it needs to be said, and maybe it's already been well covered and implied, but when we talk about other states, we have to keep in mind the framework of Georgia. And in Georgia, we have 159 counties. We have the second most of any state in the union. That means they're smaller geographically. They are empowered to provide municipal services in addition to the services they provide on behalf of the state. And then all of our 530 plus cities have those municipal powers as well. What I tell my students at UGA is that local government in Georgia, cities and counties can compete to provide the same services to the same people with the same revenues. And so we have created and fostered a competitive model, and that's why I think some of this storm and drone, you can't pull on one thing over here in a county with a local government and not make the whole mobile jingle, because everything has an impact. To that point, I think when y'all are talking and thinking about, well, what's the long-term impact on counties, there's an impact on the other cities in these counties too, and there's an implication, especially when you talk about sales taxes. And new cities have the capacity, depending on whether or not they provide enough services to qualify for LOST, whether they're in a county that has host. There's an impact on all of the existing local governments. But to my point about municipal incorporation and the standards, that's you have to keep in mind the enacted municipality statute, which y'all talked about. I just want to mention, because I didn't hear it earlier, House Bill 477, which passed this session, talks about any new city that was created since 2005 has to take over county road right-of-ways. My legal interpretation, as yet unlitigated or tested by a court, is that means that a new city is going to have to provide road maintenance. Because if you take the road right-of-way, you bought it, you broke it. You take the whole thing and the whole responsibility for it. So I think if you read that in tandem with the enacted municipality statute, roads is one of the three services, so that you'd have to provide that service and two others, or however you get to your minimum three. I wanted to point out, we talked about the votes. I heard y'all mention this is just a little chart that shows when the votes for the cities that have been created took place and what the votes were. And I think, just as an observation, as we have proceeded in the process, those margins have narrowed. And I think, for whatever reason, that's just a phenomena to be aware of, and it kind of helps me, leads me to the suggestion, the alternative I'm going to put out there for y'all to consider in a minute. With respect to the feasibility studies, it's already been discussed. This is a rule that came about under Chairman Scott's time, and it's been maintained to this day. In terms of the methodology and what we're trying to do in these studies, I think it's fair to say that we don't study the long-term impact on the other local governments. I mean, these studies are designed to kind of show you, and the way that we have designed the test is based on what's being collected in taxes from the area now, being given to the county that's providing the service. Would those revenues meet the needs if the city took it over and provided it? Now, counties are under no obligation, and in fact, in many instances, it wouldn't make sense for them to keep their records in a way that showed us exactly how much it costs to provide services to this particular part of our unincorporated area. So the solution that we tried to find in order to be able just to test viability was to look at what peer cities have done and to try to find cities that offer levels of service comparable to what the proposed city is going to do, to look at what those costs are. We dig into the capital, we dig into the operating, and we apply that out, trying to take into consideration the geographic size and the population of the proposed city. And we've always tried to err in these on the side of being more expensive. We build in contingency funds into those budgets, which some governments operate without entirely, so that you're giving, you're erring on the side of being more expensive. But they aren't tests of a budget. They are not a budget. They don't set the priorities or make the taxing decisions that a as yet unelected city council will make. And so I think that that's, part of maybe some of the misinterpretation of the public is that we're somehow telling exactly what the budget of the new city was going to be. What we're doing is testing, do ends meet needs? As I mentioned, the sales tax in each jurisdiction, the sales tax mix and the service delivery mix is different. 146 of our counties have the local option sales tax. There are a handful of counties where local option sales tax is dedicated to the schools. We have 2 counties where we have the homestead option sales tax, and we have some counties where that's neither of those things are present. So all of that leads me up to this alternative to suggest, and I think it may or may not meet with some of your concerns, and it may be a way that you can kind of craft some sort of hybrid or changes to whatever it is you're looking at in terms of process. It's been mentioned, my colleague heard me speak to the Senate a couple of days ago. We are one of only 7 states where there's such a thing as an incorporation bill, and the state legislature handles this process. The overwhelming majority of states, 34, provide for a petition process where petitions bearing signatures, a certain percentage of the registered voters or a certain formula involving both landowners and voters, is provided to some sort of receiving entity, a court, a commission, or in some instances a county commission, to evaluate whether it meets minimum criteria established by the state legislature. And then I went through, and so those requirements typically give an opportunity to set the boundaries in the petition. So if you're gathering petition boundaries, when you're looking at that petition what the boundaries of the proposed city are. And I don't throw stones or make blame. I just think many of us would agree in 2013 when we had 3 mutually exclusive city proposals being studied by us and between GSU and us, and I think there was pressure on legislators, there was pressure on the institutions, there was pressure on all the citizens and confusion. The benefit of a petition process is that if you get your ducks in a row first, if you set your boundaries up, you conduct, and feasibility studies can be conducted as a part of that process, you get your petition verified first, then other groups will have to either work around you to bring their own petition or accept that that's what's currently going forward. It's a first-in-time rule. I frankly think that might have driven some groups together to cooperate earlier on in the process. Because if you know that that's going to happen, that there's going to be a deadline, that the boundaries have to be set, it creates an incentive. And it takes some pressure off of, frankly, legislators who are trying to deal with 1,000 bills in a 3-month-long or 4-month-long legislative session. Just as a listing of how the different states do this, in these states that I've given for you to have, the petitions go to a court to review the sufficiency of the petition. In these states, it goes to a county commission. and in these states there's a state boundary commission or other state agency. I think, I'm talking in great generalities here. You'd want to craft something that met the unique circumstances of Georgia. I mean, all these states, in some of these states, there are much closer defined, more defined roles about what cities and counties do. And the services that they provide in a lot of places have revenue sources that are more closely tied to the provision of that particular service. So even though that's kind of this is a widely adopted phenomena, the circumstances on the ground about how local governments operate is not the same in all of these states. And I think that needs to be remembered. Could these groups do it? If you think about back to where we started this process, and ultimately, I think it needs to be recognized what all of you are trying to do is figure out what's best for the citizens. We get locked into kind of and I've been a victim of this too, and an agitator as well. What's cities and counties? Ultimately, the question we're all trying to resolve, I think, in our own way, is what's the best for the citizens, and which citizens? Could these groups get a petition? Sure, they could. At the Hargett Library at UGA, there's a petition that was filed bearing the signatures of 23,000 registered voters in Sandy Springs, and that was in 2002 in their latest effort. And so I think, these groups can get that. It gives you an opportunity to get some of the early work done. You could have an outside commission. You could have a bifurcated process probably where it went to a commission before coming to the legislature if you wanted the legislature to still be involved. But I just throw that out there to say that's another way of thinking about this or doing it and getting some of these decisions and questions answered in an early way.
Thank you, Ted. We do have a question or two for you. Representative Oliver, please.
This is a question I expect you might have to research or get back to us. I don't expect an answer now, but if we imposed the obligation to do an analysis of money lost from the county, that's going to change the cost of the feasibility study, I would guess, and I'd like to know what that cost would change. And if we decided that there had to be some process for updating the feasibility study based on some, and I'll use the word significant, that would be defined in some way, change of tax base, would you charge for that? And can you realistically do a turnaround on that in the General Assembly timetable of the last 10 days of the General Assembly session? You may want to think about those answers before you offer up responses.
I definitely agree that I need to think about that. To the point though is that it is extraordinarily difficult to hit a moving target, and the nature of the methodology that we use relies very heavily on the tax basis of the city, because what the comparative digest value is in the incorporated area is then used to calculate the revenues. In terms of significant, that I think y'all want flexibility in the process. Say, as a general rule, commercial properties are generally to the good of the local government's finances and having a jurisdiction in residential properties. When you start adding and working on and mixing and changing that commercial residential mix, it becomes very challenging.
For the benefit of the committee members, you probably need be aware that there's a media contest on the accuracy of the feasibility study for one of our new cities being voted on in November based on a changing map changed by the Senate after our locked in stone map was made that changed significantly the commercial division. So that's a pretty relevant issue to me right now. Yeah, we have different views of this process.
Well, I think the controversy, I think, is we actually were prepared to release a study during the legislative session when the state Senate changed the boundaries. We had to recalculate everything. So we did do that. I think the controversy that I've seen is that we did not apply the millage cap in the bill to and thereby limit the property taxes in the study. And the answer with respect to that is that we try to anchor feasibility in what's being done now, in collected there now. We're not satisfied. And I think that's a little bit of our frustration is the public's misinterpretation of what we're trying to establish in the feasibility study. Even if that article that came out is correct and that the diminution of the revenue is such that there's $100,000 less than revenues, it doesn't mention that there was $800,000 contingency expense accounted for. It doesn't talk about what y'all been talking about, which is that a city has one little authority to amend its charter and abolish the cap. Cities don't budget themselves typically in a way to generate millions of dollars in surplus. They're nonprofit service providers, so they're going to set the rates as such that they meet the level of services.
To the extent this is a relevant conversation, and there's arguments that it's not, I just am thinking very pragmatically about the logistics of cost and the logistics of a changing fiscal study, to the extent we want to address that in any kind of policy.
Well, and I think, to the extent that I'm being selfish, having a definite boundary and definite parameters will create for a better study.
Thank you, and I would call on Chairman Taylor.
Work with you on this forever, and I would just, again, not questions, but having been through this process, the CVI studies are a snapshot, is what I'll call it, of services provided by the county, services that would be taken over by the city. But again, you made a point that the elected officials in that particular city may deviate from whatever snapshot you took at that point. I think most of them have. What I will say is the CVI studies have been consistently through Sandy Springs, Dunwoody, Milton, all that, conservative on the revenue side and high on the expense side. I think most of the cities, and I think Mayor Paul, Councilman Mattson will agree, that most of the cities have realized more revenues just because of captured things like business licenses that weren't done or anything like that. But end of the day, the CVI study, and to your point, is not the governance of the city. It's a snapshot of what the current revenues and expenditures are based on a snapshot at the current time. What the city council decides to do is something else. So there's no guarantee that what you provided as studies was going to end up at the end of the day.
I guess, and two other points, I guess, to the questions you've been asked. If you want to think about ways to study, there's a short-term budget hit that I think you can see in the current studies to the county. Simply look down the revenue list and look at which is in our scheme of revenue from Iowa or county revenue source. That's a short-term budgetary hit. The bigger and much tougher question to answer is long-term. What does that do to kind of service provision for the remainder of the area they're serving municipal services? To what extent can they capture efficiencies and not having to provide services to as many people? And then there's the other side of that too, which is what if the demand is greater for those services? Taxation doesn't follow equally dollar for dollar how much you receive when you pay taxes. And so if there are areas that are of greater need within these jurisdictions, that's a huge policy issue for all the rest of us. How we would, in terms of coming up with prices, just thinking of how to measure that requires some real framework. Long-term sales tax implications are
Thank you. And Chairman Reinders.
Yeah, these are four, but I think they're probably yes or no. Since you're recommending the petition, has the Carl Vinson Institute, or to look at that, and I'm always curious intellectually about that, has the Carl Vinson Institute done a study of petitions?
We haven't done a study of petitions.
So you don't know how many people sign them that aren't registered voters?
Well, no. Presumably you would have some sort of validation.
Do you know how many people would sign them based on the way in which it was presented? Just like polling. How you ask the question.
Sure. The details of what's in the petition will differ.
And again, what I want is I want an informed electorate. Since we're talking about all the people that are misled, if you ever watch, I love it. Y'all have fun. Go watch, what is that show, Impractical Jokers? Y'all ever seen that? And the people that can get to sign a petition, this is to save animals that don't even exist. And oh yeah, okay. And that's just why I'm always curious. I want to make sure if we're going to if we're going to do it as efficiently as possible, if someone's getting a petition signed and said, that's because we're going to lower your tax dollars and we just want to be able to study it, okay, I'll sign it.
Well, and I think
Isn't that problematic? Could be.
I think you can have problems with any process. I think I should be clear, though, that what I was suggesting as an alternative is a way of, a benefit of getting recognizing citizens form the front end. I wasn't suggesting do it as a referendum. All these states have a referendum process. So it's a belt and suspenders, sure.
I'm the junkie that would actually like to read it and look at the map and all that kind of good stuff. But if you're going to tell me everybody would that signed one of those, then Saturday afternoon while I'm at Piggly Wiggly, I don't think they'll take the time to do that. A lot of them. So, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Rinders. Thank you, Chairman Rinders. And if we have no further questions from the committee members, we will move on to the public comment portion of our meeting. Okay, it appears that we have 13 folks that have signed up to speak, and we have limited this to 2 minutes each. If you are in a group and you can have one spokesperson, that would be wonderful. The first person that signed in is Sharon Whitmore. We would call on you at this time.
Thank you, Representative Tankersley and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to comment today. My name is Sharon Whitmore, and I'm currently serving as the Chief Financial Officer for Fulton County. We have provided you with a one-page briefing document which highlights some information regarding the impact of incorporations and annexation in Fulton County since 2005. And we've also included some suggestions to the committee to consider as well. We are scheduled, I believe, to present to you at the October 6th hearing, and we have a longer time period set aside for that. So for today, I just really want to cover a couple of highlights. Currently, Fulton County provides municipal services, police, fire, parks and recreation, zoning, and permitting to the remaining unincorporated area of the county, which is in South Fulton. We provide those services through a special services taxing district that was put in place in 2006, replacing the special services taxing district that had served all of unincorporated Fulton County, both north and south, since the 1980s. Since 2005, we have experienced 4 incorporations and several hundred annexations, and we currently have one active incorporation initiative underway for South Fulton and several pending annexations. Most of our comments really dealt around the annexation area, specifically with regard to budgetary impact around the timing of when the annexations occur, in line with your annual budget process and taxation cycle, as well as the impact to the overall service delivery efforts undertaken by the county to provide those municipal services to the remaining unincorporated areas, and also the impact to public schools. So we look forward to being able to speak with you more on October 6th, and at that point our county attorney will have some additional comments concerning the annexation legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Whitmore. Next we have Linda Bryant, and if you would please introduce yourself and who you're with.
Good morning. I'm Linda Bryant with the Fulton County School Board. I'm Vice President of the School Board. Schools today can cost and do cost money. We are not here to give you an opinion on any particular annexation, but we want to share with the committee the impact annexation have on school districts in Georgia. Every school has an attendance boundary. Fulton has 100 schools. When changes are needed in those boundaries, no matter how small, we engage the community multiple times, at least a year in advance. We examine all options and attempt to determine all the unintended consequences, because there can be a real impact to student learning. Placing a student in an entirely different building with different teachers, students, and norms can be very disruptive. That is why we are so careful with this process. We have a board policy which outlines every step of the process, which is very transparent. A school community is sometimes the strongest fabric that holds the neighborhood together, a critical foundation for our children. It should never be disrupted unless absolutely necessary. Yet, Under the current law, when an annexation occurs, school districts are not even required to be notified. There is no requirement that the impact on schools be considered or even known by the existing authority. The results can be extremely disruptive to our students, our community, and very expensive to our taxpayers. School districts are typically operated at or above capacity. Building schools is very expensive. It is now at the high 80 millions. Taxpayers on the district pay for these schools. School districts plan 7 to 10 years in advance for facility changes, upgrades, and addition. These are typically funded by SPLOST, which must go before voters and detail how all the money will be spent. They also attempt to have clean feeder patterns, meaning that we try to keep our kids together from elementary to high school. Parents, administrators, and students agree that this is an approach for best for children.
Ms. Bryant, your 2 minutes are up. Please wrap up quickly.
All right.
Thank you.
In summary, in addition to the economic cost of an annexation, that can be a real impact on our student learning. Also, we have been given a little more time on October the 6th, so we'd like to come back and present to you
Thank
in
you.
more
Please
detail.
do, and you're welcome to submit written comments. And thank you for being here today.
Okay.
Next, it appears that we have four folks from Stonecrest City Alliance, and I don't know if they've appointed a spokesperson, and you would be?
Yes, ma'am. I'm Bernard Knight, and Mr. Jason Larry, I believe he's listed first, but he would like to, although he would like to speak, he would like to yield his place in line to me if it's all right with you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Please proceed.
My name is Bernard Knight. I'm the attorney for Kelly Land Company, and my clients and I are both members and enthusiastic supporters of the Stonecrest City Alliance. In addition, I'm advisor to the board of the Stonecrest City Alliance. I'm going to put aside my prepared remarks and instead address what I've heard today about the so-called city light concept, and of course the allegation that city lights are unconstitutional. We first heard this argument back at the first hearing of Senator Elena Parent's study committee on the Senate side. It was raised by Mr. Ken Jarrett, who is the county attorney for Forsyth County and other counties, and he made the point quite forcefully. After that hearing, I got in touch with Mr. Gerard. We had a series of communications. He is a very courteous, very professional gentleman, and at the end of the communications, he agreed with me that the proposed city of Stonecrest, and by the way, it passed the Senate with only one dissenting vote in the last session, and it's currently in Chairman Reinder's committee for the House, that this proposed city of Stonecrest is not a city light, as Mr. Gerard, and I suppose the county the Association of County Commissioners would define it. Neither is the city of La Vista Hills. Our charters in relevant respects are identical. They were drafted by the same council, and they are both based, to my understanding, on the model charter which was prepared by the Georgia Municipal Association. We do not purport to restrict the power of the city council to provide services. Although we do anticipate that only a limited menu will initially be provided, there is nothing in the charter which proposes to restrict their power to provide services. In that respect, La Vista Hills and Stonecrest are not subject to this constitutional challenge. On the other hand, the city of Tucker, the proposed city of Tucker charter, does have such a restriction, which is similar for the most part to the existing city of Peachtree Corners charter. Those possibly do have problems, but we should not be lumped together with them, and you all should please do not think at all that we are subject to this constitutional challenge. I see my time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. Next, we have Jason Lowry. Is that right? I'm sorry. Come forward and introduce yourself if you're waiting.
My name is Joel Thibodeau. I'm also with the Stonecrest City Alliance. I'm going to swap places with Mr. Jason Larry and give my comments now. I was formerly with the Senate Budget Office, and I'm now the Director of Audits and Compliance with the DeKalb County School District. Communities form cities for different reasons. They have different reasons for seeking self-determination. and those reasons are primarily driven by local economics as much as local politics. As we see the increased density and consequently complexity of county populations, not just in the metro area, but throughout growing areas in the state, and as we see increasing opportunities in the growing economic recovery, there will be only increased appetite among citizens to be free of larger, less responsive, and more less local county governments in order to seize upon those opportunities that exist now. With county governments dealing with competing demands from growing and more diverse electorates, the best option for economically feasible areas to capitalize on opportunities for economic growth, to stabilize neighborhoods, and to attract talented and creative residents, and to improve the quality of life overall, is to harness the powers of incorporation and cityhood for the purpose of self-determination. Now, there are many ways to improve the process and standardize the method for creating new municipalities without taking critical choices out of the hands of the communities that these governments will serve. How a government serves its people is at the core of any process for incorporation and is the core of why it exists in the first place. It is fair to consider the fiscal impact on county governments. It is fair to consider the tax impact on residents of the city. And it is fair to include greater public participation in the process. It is not fair to mandate county at-large referenda for the formation of cities, nor is it fair to change the rules during the current biennial for which rules were already established for cityhood bills already in the process.
Mr. Thibodeau, your 2 minutes are up.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Okay, and I believe we have Jason Larry.
Yes, ma'am. Madam Chair, with your permission, may I give you a document here?
Sure. We'll take it right here, so you can. You can go ahead and speak, please.
So, Madam Chair, what we have today is what I'm passing, or what you have in front of you is several pieces of paper with regards to the map itself and how it overlaps with some of the things that are happening here. So, in brief, we are a proposed city of 50,000. And with that proposed city of 50,000, this is the physical map that you see in front of you that has been in place for 2 years now. Prior to this, it was 80,000. We did not pass our feasibility study that first year. We came back the second year, as I mentioned earlier. Now we moved, through the Senate. So one thing that Representative Taylor mentioned is that there's an opportunity to learn during time. This is our third seat at the dance. So we've had an opportunity to learn and for engaging more citizenry about what they want. Quite frankly, we are a multicultural, multiracial, multi-business opportunity with regards to forming our own city. And Mr. Baggett mentioned this earlier. It goes back to the citizenry. What do the citizens want in this area? And in this particular corridor, we want to be self-governed, self-managed, and self-determined on our own. As a 30-year DeKalb County taxpayer, I am sure that it is our time and our opportunity now to be able to do this. The second page is the industrial park, highly neglected area that is very core with regards to the Stonecrest opportunity. The county is not looking at doing anything with this or focusing business in our area. What we have is an opportunity to build our own business, take care of our own self, tote our own water, carry our own bucket. And that's what everybody wants in this particular area. Last page, or next to the last page, our Stonecrest overlay map with regards to the businesses that are in that area. And page number 4, our highly touted Arabia Mountain National Heritage Area. So, in short, we have a 90% approval rate amongst the citizenry and the businesses in our area. 2 is that we're in our third opportunity to be able to pass and get things going in this area. And 3, this is our time, folks. And we now have an opportunity to self-manage ourselves and do the things that we can make happen in our own given territory. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, you have Wesley Dowdy.
He's departed.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we're going to move on now.
Mr. Dowdy is CEO and president of Duke Hospitality, and unfortunately, he had to be called away at noon. He apologizes to y'all.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. Okay, next we have Harold Reed with South Fulton Now.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, I wanted to come before you now. Full disclosure, yes, I work with South Fulton Now, and we are an advocacy group for the formation of a new city in South Fulton. I wanted to bring up some issues that are really one main issue that we have found ourselves confronted with. Now, we are far along in the process, so this wouldn't necessarily affect us, but it should be considered in any recommendations that you come up with. Specifically, I'm thinking about when borders are established. We ran into a situation, being the last unincorporated area in Fulton County, that we are surrounded by other municipalities. We were left alone for the longest period, and we were just chugging right along. However, once we announced that we wanted to become an incorporated area, then the cherry picking started, and everybody started to grab those areas that they could get their hands on. I know they wanted to expand their boundaries, but in the process, they decreased our area. Now, it was unfair to us because we, as normal citizens, had raised the money to do the feasibility study to show that we were financially viable. Now, we don't think we reached a point where we are no longer financially viable. However, if the cherry picking continues, who knows? Then we, as citizens, would have to raise money again for another financial study. Add to that, when we are as just citizens put our efforts into it, yet a municipality can draw upon their entire legal departments and any other resources they may have to fight what we're trying to do. Oh,
wrap up quickly.
Well, again, please consider some way of firming up those boundaries and stop any other annexation or incorporation efforts until that one can be finalized.
That's a good point. Thank you.
Madam Chair, that's kind of my point about sometimes we start seeing the annexation happen really for the purpose of stopping the city and not people gaining the system.
I understand what you're saying. Okay, next we have Rusty Paul with the City of Sandy Springs.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee. It's my pleasure to be with you as the representative of the oldest of the new cities that you've incorporated. When we were doing the incorporation referendum, I told the folks in Sandy Springs that the day would come when they would be just as mad at the city council and the mayor as they ever were with the county commission. And if you've been to any of our zoning hearings lately, you will know that I was neither a seer nor a prophet, but experienced, I guess you would say. And that's the nature of local government. It deals with some of the hardest questions that you have. But I think that if the citizens of Sandy Springs had it to go over again, we approved the original referendum by 92%, and I think you would see 10 years later, an overwhelming support for it today. Why? Because they can see me everywhere. At the festival, at the grocery store, at the hardware store, even at church. As Representative Oliver knows, I serve communion at my local Episcopal church. I now go down the altar rail saying, "Blood of Christ, see me after church. Blood of Christ, come me after church." Because they stop me on the altar rail to ask me questions about what's going on in the city. And so that's what makes this work so well. You know, you have that local experience, that local contact that makes a difference. Now, Georgia has a number of options. We have cities and counties that have consolidated. in Columbus, in Augusta, in Athens, other cities across town. We have options. If your system's not working, then you ought to have the ability. It's the American right. It's what made us who we are. The ability to have self-determination about who we are and how we govern ourselves. And this is just one of them. I like Mr. Lanier's idea about townships. Maybe we need some kind of transitional form of government that doesn't deal all the way to making incorporation. May take some constitutional work to make that happen, but we need to give folks the option. That's the great thing about this country. We give people the option, and I'm leaving, Madam Chairman, the option to make those determinations on their own, what fits best for them. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next, we have Cindy Mills with Forsyth County Board of Commissioners.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. I'm Vice Chair for Forsyth County, and we are faced with the dilemma, and I can barely say my name in 2 minutes, but I appreciate so much y'all having us here today. I think it shows profound leadership that you've put this committee together, and I think it also says that you know that there is a problem at hand, that you've let this sort of slip, that you've got some problems that you're faced with. One of the first things that I saw 3 years ago was we have too many counties in the state of Georgia. We've got a lot of counties that are suffering, a lot of counties that are not financially viable. That have a lot, they're having trouble making ends meet. And then we've got a lot of counties that are financially sound that are carrying the weight of some counties that are not in lots of different ways. And instead of empowering those counties, we're creating now more and more cities that seem to be weakening that financial stability. And I think that as leaders, that you're doing the right thing and you're looking at it and you're taking a hard look at what are we doing. And I think I am very impressed with some of the questions that you've asked today, because they're good questions that leaders ask. Are the reasons we're creating these cities political? And I think we all know the answer to that question is yes. A lot of times they are. And are we really bringing it to give the people their choice? Or are we doing it because it's political? Are we really doing it to bring government closer to the people? Or is it really about elitism? Is it really about something else? Seldom do you see a lot of cities being created in areas of poverty. I mean, let's be realistic in what we're doing and why we're doing it. And are we weakening our own state at the same time? And I just wanted to thank you for doing this. I want to thank you. I mean, we're in a county that's faced with it. As a grandmother, I don't want to weaken Forsyth County. I want it to be strong for my grandchildren. I don't want to create something that's a legacy that we are weakening our county instead of making it stronger. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate your comments. We have Brian Tam with Forsyth County Board of Education.
Yes, ma'am. Madam Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thank you for your service. I am a commissioner in Forsyth County going on 11 years, where we boast a AAA bond rating and one of the lowest millage rates in the area. I'm not wanting to sit up here and try to lobby for or against cityhood, but I think that it is critical to determine the legitimacy of the city light concept, because there is a campaign for a city that boasts no tax increase and limited powers for a new city. And the discussions here today are concerning. And if there is no legitimacy to a city light, somebody needs to say it out loud so that people aren't voting under the pretense of limited government and no tax increase. And that's a hard job. I know it is. And I'm grateful that a committee has been assembled to look at this, to hear the concerns. And once again, I appreciate your service. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our last person that signed in is Dale Provenzano, and he's the chairman of the Board of Commissioners in Glenn County, I believe.
Yes, ma'am. And again, thank you for the time.
I must suggest I'm very new to politics, but in deference to one of my colleagues here, I'm agreeable to everybody. I live on an island that's got a lot of wealth. I grew up in Atlanta. I went to school in Cobb. I went to school in Atlanta City Schools. I finished up at Georgia Tech. And I know there's some more studies that need to be happening. I do want to suggest that I really keyed in on the stuff that you guys were talking about. We need to understand not only what happens with the new cities that are being established, but we need to understand with what happens to the rest of the community, and that's my concern. With all deference, I have 5 billionaires that live in my district, U.S. Senator, 2 state representatives, a state senator, a 3rd U.S. State rep, if you count Wilkinson. I think he's trying to vote in 2 districts. But he does. His wife votes for me, and he gets to vote from somewhere else. I mean, I've got 18 professional golfers, several professional baseball players. It's an island of wealth. And then as I see, and I want you guys to understand, this is not just a metro area. I grew up here, and I understand what's going on. And I think there's a lot to be said about representation. And that's the important thing here. But there's a big difference between trying to get representation with 600,000 and 700,000 people, and we've only got 80,000 people in Glen. It's hard to govern when you've got all the wealthy and all the poor, and it's also hard to govern when you have all these different sizes. And I really hope you guys take that into respect, and I appreciate your time. Yes. Yes, you have.
Chairman Reinders, just 1 minute. Let's get your...
Just real quick, I've met with some of those folks, and it is political sometimes. And again, that's why when I said Sandy Springs, it's political the other way. The county tells somebody no. It cuts both ways. Yes. If you got a county commissioner sitting in Brunswick who's looking at this and don't care as much about St. Simon's as they should, or that perception is, how do we fix that? Because neither one of them's 100% wrong or 100% right.
And you're right. It's a very difficult fix. It's very hard for us to govern when you have 2 ends of the political spectrum. Right. And so I think we fix it because if you look at the island in general, on this one particular issue, and I think we've got this all over, I think the representation's there. Maybe you come up with a rule that says you have to have at least 50,000 people before you begin a new city. I mean, how small do you want these new cities to be? That's really where you might want to go with this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments. And we do have one person on the list to hear from, and that's Ed Williams, Citizens Against Cityhood in DeKalb. Okay.
Thank you, committee, for allowing me to speak. I came in late, so that's why my name was just added to the list. I want you all to know I'm a regular citizen and I live in DeKalb County, but I wanted to speak and give voice to the people who are not pushing cityhood and that are actually against cityhood. I started the organization a year ago because I believe DeKalb is strongest as one county government and does not need more cities. I'm against Tucker, I'm against La Vista Hills, I'm against Stonecrest, and I'm against Greenhaven being formed as cities. And also I'm against new cities being formed in Fulton County. I, like one of the other speakers talked about earlier, can't understand why the counties in South Georgia can unify and become one government, yet in the metro area we seem to be splitting up into multiple cities. I think we're best and strongest as one unit, and I'm totally against cityhoods in DeKalb County. What I would like the committee to do is to give more deliberation in the process, add a petition to the front end of the process so the community has time to understand what is going on in our counties. A lot of the citizens south of DeKalb don't even know about cityhood and what is being pushed on them. So I would like this process to go beyond 1 year and 2 years and to a minimum of 5 years to give citizens enough time to understand what the implications are for a city being imposed on them instead of waiting till the referendum occurs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And that ends the public portion, public comments.
I thought I'd signed up. Is it Bates Madison? I wondered if my name.
You know,
Over by chance.
you were here, and I checked you off. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I just did that.
Thank you.
Please speak. I just struck your name.
Yeah, I guess my reputation
I put a
precedes
check by
me.
your name. It doesn't. I'm sorry. Please comment
Thank you.
for us.
My name is Bates Madison. I serve as the Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Brookhaven, Georgia's newest city. So we've had the oldest, now the newest. Thank you for your service and the time to allow me to speak today. It was very interesting to hear the dialogue that y'all heard in the testimony here. I'd just like to lead with a little bit of credibility to the Carl Vincent Institute. In our CVI study for Brookhaven, there were a lot of people arguing against the city who predicted that the CVI study was inaccurate and that we were going to be Brookhaven, not Brookhaven. Well, in our first year, we actually we had projected CVI surpluses of $1 million of net reserves. After the first year, our actual first year net reserves were $2 million. Since the existence of the City of Brookhaven, which was formed in December of 2012, we've actually, by the end of this year, we'll have $4.5 million in reserve. And we've done that while we've lowered our millage rate every single year of our existence, now down to match Dunwoody's millage rate at 2.74. I'd like to add to the issue that came up about additional layers of government. Well, there is no new layer of government here. We have taken over the services for specific operations from DeKalb County, and those really are for our police, our parks, and our permitting. And as Mayor Paul said, yes, I can't go to the grocery store anymore without someone coming up and grabbing me because local representation is there. You see the people in the community. I represent a district of 12,500 people, and I know, and even though I'm actually running unopposed right now, I'm still going out and knocking on doors and talking to people because it's an enjoyable thing to do. To the effect about the issue of legacy cost burdens, I think that that's an issue that the county needs to address. When we still pay for county operations, we still pay for county bonds, and we pay for county operations within our city because we're still citizens of DeKalb County. So whether or not DeKalb County addresses, if they have not fully funded their pension obligations, that's an issue which you need to hold the counties accountable to, not hold the issues of the city. And just as a last point, the ACC recommendations on newly incorporated areas that I heard recommended to you tonight, in my opinion, implementing either suggestion would be devastating and be the end of newly incorporated cities in Georgia. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any final comments or questions by committee members?
I just want to ask Bates, running unopposed is enjoyable, or or knocking on doors?
Knocking on doors. It's okay. Still getting charged up.
Well, just in closing, I want to say, again, we heard a lot of issues relating to incorporation of new municipalities, and I think we all realize they're significant, and they do impact the very citizens that we serve and impacts us as legislators. And we do want to have these methods in this process to be clearly defined and certainly serve in the best interest of our citizens. Our next meeting will be October the 6th. I welcome you to come back. It will again probably be in this room, I believe, and we'll begin at 10 o'clock. So we are adjourned. Thank you.